Did you ever stop to wonder what the average morning looked like for a medieval peasant? No gentle brewing of coffee or a steaming cup of tea. In fact, contrary to what most of us might expect, many of them would start their day with a glass of beer. Yes, beer, right there at the crack of dawn. Strange, isn't it? But here's the twist. That morning pint wasn't just a habit born out of leisure or indulgence. It was a vital ritual that quite literally helped save their lives. Now, before you raise an eyebrow and imagine peasants waking up bleary-eyed and reaching for a frothy pint like it's their morning cuppa, let's step back and picture what their world was really like. It was a harsh existence. The air thick with smoke from open fires, the earth muddied and cluttered with refuse, and water? Well, water was often a risky gamble. Rivers and wells, their main sources, were frequently contaminated with all manner of nasties. Without the sanitation we take for granted today, drinking water was a roll of the dice that could end badly, often very badly. So, here's the first nugget of truth that's absolutely key. Medieval peasants routinely chose beer over water first thing in the morning because it was simply safer. It's a notion that sounds odd to us now, but back then, it made perfect sense. The process of brewing beer involved boiling the water, which killed off many harmful bacteria lurking in those murky sources. Then, fermentation would follow, creating a drink that was not only safer, but also nourishing in ways that pure water wasn't. Imagine waking up before the sun has even climbed the sky, your body aching from yesterday's back-breaking toil in the fields, your stomach's rumbling, but food might be scarce or hard to prepare quickly. Instead of just gulping down questionable water, you pour yourself a small beer, the kind they called small beer, with very low alcohol content, somewhere between 0.5 and 2.5%. It was watery enough to drink in quantity, but packed with enough calories, some protein, and B vitamins to help fuel the day's labor. A morning pint, yes, but one that was practical, nourishing, and protective. Now, here's where it gets fascinating. This small beer wasn't just an occasional treat, it was part of daily life. Archaeological digs and historical records show that peasants drank it multiple times throughout the day. It was a constant companion, a humble lifeline. Because let's be honest, when you're bending over the earth all day long, digging, planting, harvesting, you need more than just water. You need energy. You need hydration. And crucially, you need something that won't make you sick. You might be wondering, surely the alcohol, even if low, would dull their senses or make them sluggish? Surprisingly, no. The alcohol content in small beer was just enough to keep it safe, not so much as to intoxicate. It was more like a mild tonic than anything else. This was a daily habit, a practical adaptation to a tough environment where every choice had consequences for survival. Let's pause for a moment and consider what this means. Those peasants weren't just drinking beer because they fancied a tipple. They were drinking it because it was their best chance against disease. Waterborne illnesses were rampant. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid, they thrived in contaminated water and could wipe out whole communities. Beer, brewed properly, was free of many of those microscopic killers. In fact, historians and scientists alike credit this habit with directly reducing disease rates among the medieval poor. Picture a medieval village. Simple cottages, muddy streets, a bustling market square. People living cheek by jowl, sharing everything from tools to troubles. Now imagine the alternative, a morning where everyone drinks from the same contaminated water source. The difference is life or death. By brewing beer daily, peasants created a safety net, a homemade medicine of sorts that kept many alive through brutal times. And here's something you might not have realized. Beer wasn't just a hygienic choice, it was a source of nutrition. Yes, beer. The fermentation process produces B vitamins, carbohydrates, and small amounts of protein, nutrients that were otherwise hard to come by, especially in the diets of the poor. Remember, medieval peasants' diets were often limited to coarse bread, porridge, and whatever vegetables they could grow. Meat was a luxury. So that glass of small beer was a surprisingly valuable part of their daily sustenance. Which brings me to another interesting point. This habit was deeply tied up with social and economic realities. Brewing beer was often done at home or locally in small breweries, making it accessible and affordable. It was woven into the fabric of community life. And because the alcohol content was low, it was safe for all ages, including children, to drink regularly. This wasn't the sort of beer we might think of today as a weekend indulgence. It was a staple, a basic necessity. Now, I bet you're curious to know how this tradition began. Was it a sudden discovery or a gradual shift? The truth is, no one set out to invent beer as a health drink. It evolved naturally over centuries as people experimented with grains and fermentation. But as they did, they learned that this bubbly, slightly sour drink was not just tasty, but also life-saving. And here we find a beautiful paradox. Something so ordinary, so everyday, was actually extraordinary. The humble morning beer was a guardian against disease, a quiet hero of medieval survival. It wasn't about drunkenness or excess. It was about practicality, necessity, and resilience. So next time you think about medieval peasants, don't just picture ragged figures toiling in the dirt. Think of them as clever survivors who understood their world in ways we're only just beginning to appreciate. Their morning beer was a clever solution to a deadly problem. It was their shield against sickness, their fuel for the day, and a social ritual that bound them together. Before we move on, let me ask you this. Have you ever considered how something so simple as a drink could shape history? How a tiny change, boiling water and fermenting it, could ripple out to save thousands of lives? It's a reminder that sometimes survival isn't about grand inventions or heroic feats. Sometimes it's about the small, everyday choices that keep us going.
In the next chapter, we'll unravel exactly how the brewing process worked to make beer so much safer than water, and explore why this ancient technique was so effective at killing the nasties that lurked in medieval water sources. We'll also look at how this habit influenced the health and longevity of entire communities. Trust me, it's a story you won't want to miss. So, pour yourself a cuppa or perhaps a pint and stay with me as we uncover the fascinating world behind medieval peasants' morning beer habit. It's a tale of survival, ingenuity, and the unexpected ways history has been shaped by the simplest of things. Hey, if you're finding this helpful, hit that subscribe button. It really helps me out. Imagine waking up on a chilly morning in medieval Europe. The sun's barely risen and you're already heading out to the well or the village stream, hoping to fill your jug with fresh water. Seems simple enough, right? But here's the twist. That water, which you'd expect to be pure and life-giving, was actually a lurking danger, often teeming with invisible threats. It wasn't just a case of bad taste or murky color. It was downright deadly. You see, back then, clean water wasn't something you could take for granted. Rivers, wells, and ponds were the main sources, yet they were regularly contaminated. It wasn't due to modern pollution like industry or chemicals, but from things far more basic and grim. Human and animal waste, rubbish, and the general mess of everyday medieval life. Without proper sanitation systems, all this filth found its way into the water people drank. Imagine the village livestock wandering close by, the open sewers draining nearby, and the rubbish heaps gradually breaking down. It became a cocktail for disaster. It's hard for us to picture now, but waterborne diseases were a terrifying reality. Every sip risked infection by bacteria, parasites, or viruses that our ancestors hadn't the means to understand or fight. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid, these were not distant medical terms, but common killers. Entire communities could be wiped out by outbreaks sparked simply by drinking what should have been a refreshing, life-sustaining liquid. The grim truth is that water meant danger more often than health. Think about it. In a world without modern plumbing, no one had taps running clean and cold. Instead, villagers relied on wells dug into the earth, and if those wells were too close to waste pits or latrines, you can imagine what seeped in. Groundwater would carry all sorts of nastiness. Some wells were better than others, sure, but even the cleanest water could be suspect. And during rainy seasons, floods would wash even more contaminants into streams and rivers, turning them into a risky business. This wasn't just a matter of inconvenience or unpleasantness. It was a matter of survival. Drinking untreated water was a gamble with your health. Illnesses caused by contaminated water were often swift and brutal. The body, weakened by hunger and hard labor, had little chance against these invisible enemies. For the average peasant, life was already a struggle. Cold winters, back-breaking work, little food. And now, add the risk of deadly sickness from something as basic as quenching your thirst. Now, here's where it gets fascinating. Peasants didn't just blindly gulp down this dangerous water. They found a clever workaround. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's imagine the scene again. Picture a typical village. Muddy and bustling, children running about, animals braying, and the constant murmur of daily toil. Water is essential, yes, but drinking it straight from the source? Too risky. On top of that, clean water was a scarce luxury. Wells might be shared, streams could be miles away, and fetching water was a task often left to women and children, consuming precious time and energy. And what about the richer folk or the clergy? They sometimes had access to better wells or collected rainwater, but for most peasants, that wasn't an option. They dealt with what they had, and that was often contaminated water. It's no surprise then that waterborne disease was so widespread. Medical knowledge was limited, and without understanding germs or bacteria, prevention was almost impossible. But here's the remarkable thing. Despite this bleak reality, peasants found a way to not just survive, but to protect themselves. They turned to a drink that seems odd to us now for breakfast. Yes, beer, but not the kind you might think of today. This was small beer, a low-alcohol brew, milder and much safer than water. The brewing process involved boiling the water, which killed off many of those harmful pathogens lurking in the source. Fermentation added a layer of protection and even some nutrition. So, in a way, beer became a shield against the dangers of water. Before we get into that, though, let's dwell a moment longer on just how hazardous water was. Historical records and archaeological findings show us the scale of the problem. Skeletons from medieval cemeteries sometimes reveal signs of diseases caused by parasites or infections linked to poor sanitation. Chronic diarrhea and other illnesses left their mark, painting a picture of a constant health battle. No one was immune. Children, adults, the elderly, all faced the risk of deadly sickness from something as basic as quenching their thirst. You might wonder, why didn't they just boil water if that was the answer? Boiling takes time and fuel, both precious commodities. Firewood was often scarce or expensive, especially for peasants who had to choose carefully what they burned. Cooking food took priority, and boiling water for drinking wasn't always practical. Besides, it wasn't common knowledge that boiling water could save lives. The science of germs was centuries away. People relied on tradition, observation, and trial and error. The absence of sanitation infrastructure was another huge factor. Imagine having your latrine or cesspit near your well, not by design, but because of cramped space or simple ignorance. Rain would wash waste into the water supply, turning wells into cesspools. Towns and villages had few regulations, and what we now call public health measures were almost non-existent. This was the norm, not an exception. Even worse, water contamination was often invisible. Unlike today, you couldn't just test water or see bacteria with a microscope. To the eye and taste buds, water might seem fine, but it was a silent killer. This invisibility made the problem all the more insidious because no one knew when they were drinking poison. The aftermath, sickness, death, was the grim reveal. So, what did peasants do about thirst? They couldn't just stop drinking. Dehydration was a real threat, especially for those working long hours in the fields. Here's where that morning beer habit comes in. Brewing beer involved boiling the water, which acted as a natural sterilizer. The fermentation process then produced acids and alcohol, even in small beer. These concentrations were enough to inhibit harmful microbes. This made beer a safer option than untreated water. Beer also provided calories and nutrients, helping to fuel hard physical labor. The carbohydrates, small amounts of protein, and vitamins from fermentation made it a surprisingly nourishing choice. So, not only were peasants protecting themselves from disease, they were actually supporting their demanding lifestyles. It's a smart survival strategy, born out of necessity and ingenuity. Now, you might be thinking, surely beer had to be strong to kill germs. Actually, the alcohol content in small beer was very low, somewhere between 0.5 and 2.5%. It was a drink you could have several times a day without becoming drunk. Fresh, mild, and safe, it served as a daily staple. Even children would drink it, not because of the alcohol, but for hydration and health. In contrast, drinking water straight from the well or river was a gamble. The risk of disease was high. By choosing beer instead, peasants inadvertently reduced their chances of falling ill. Historical studies link beer consumption to lower rates of waterborne diseases, showing how this practice literally saved lives. So, what does this tell us about medieval life? It's a reminder that survival often meant adapting creatively to harsh realities. Peasants weren't just passive victims of their environment. They found ways to protect themselves and their families. The humble beer mug became more than a vessel for a drink. It was a lifeline. And here's a thought to leave you with. Next time you pour yourself a pint, remember that this simple pleasure has a deep history. For medieval peasants, beer wasn't just a treat. It was a daily necessity, protecting them when the world around them was full of unseen dangers. In the next chapter, we'll uncover exactly how brewing beer worked its magic to transform dangerous water into a life-saving drink. You'll learn about the fascinating science behind small beer and why it wasn't just safer,
but surprisingly nutritious too. So stay with me. There's a whole world of medieval alchemy and survival waiting to be revealed. Now picture this for a moment. A weary medieval peasant waking before dawn, preparing for a day of back-breaking labor in fields that stretch as far as the eye can see. Before they even touch the first mouthful of solid food, there's a simple, humble drink in hand. But it's not what we might expect. It's not tea, coffee, or even plain water. It's beer. And not just any beer, small beer, a mild brew with barely a whisper of alcohol. You might wonder, why on earth would they start their day with beer? Well, here's where it gets fascinating. Back then, clean water was more of a luxury than a given.
Rivers and wells, the usual sources, were often tainted with all sorts of nasties, bacteria, parasites, and other invisible threats that could swiftly turn a person's day from hard work to hopeless misery. Drinking untreated water was a bit like rolling the dice with your health. So what could they do? That's where the magic of brewing comes in. You see, the process of making beer wasn't just about flavor or pleasure, it was a matter of survival. The brewing process involved boiling water, which played a crucial part in killing off harmful microorganisms. Imagine the peasants gathering around a large cauldron, watching as barley and water were heated to a rolling boil. This boiling step was an early form of sterilization, long before anyone thought about germs or bacteria. It meant that the water, once a potential death trap, was transformed into something far safer to drink. Now, here's a little detail that often slips under the radar. This boiling didn't just clear water of bugs, it also prepared the environment for the next crucial stage, fermentation. As the boiled mixture cooled, natural yeasts would begin their work, turning sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide. This wasn't just a happy accident, it was a natural preservative. The alcohol, even in small amounts, and the acids produced during fermentation created conditions hostile to many nasty bacteria. In a very real sense, fermentation was nature's way of putting a lock on the door against spoilage and disease. So you might ask, how much alcohol are we really talking about in this small beer? It was nothing like the strong ales or porters we might imagine today. Small beer typically ranged from about 0.5% to 2.5% alcohol by volume, almost like a modern-day kombucha or light ale. It was weak enough to be drunk throughout the day without intoxicating the drinker, but potent enough to keep the beverage safe and fresh. This meant peasants could sip on it regularly, hydrating themselves while also fueling their bodies. And fuel their bodies it did. The malted barley used in brewing wasn't just about flavor, it provided a decent source of carbohydrates, some protein, and even a sprinkle of B vitamins, all thanks to the fermentation process. This was especially important for peasants and laborers, whose days were filled with back-breaking work. Imagine the energy demands of digging, harvesting, or tending to livestock. Without a steady supply of calories, the body would simply give up. Small beer quietly stepped in as a nourishing companion, helping to sustain strength and stamina. But let's not forget the bigger picture here. The brewing process was a social and economic lifeline. Brewing wasn't just something done in grand castles or monasteries. It was a daily household affair for many peasants. Women often took charge of the brewing, crafting batches of small beer to see their families through the day. In a world without refrigeration or modern sanitation, this was a reliable way to ensure safe hydration. It wasn't just about quenching thirst, it was a practical solution to a deadly problem. There's an interesting historical thread here, too. Records from the medieval period, and even archaeological finds, confirm just how widespread beer consumption was among peasants. Clay jugs, brewing tools, and references in manuscripts tell a story of a society where beer was as essential as bread. It was a staple, a medicine cabinet, and an energy drink all in one humble brew. Now, what about water then? Why couldn't people simply boil water and drink it plain? Well, boiling water was certainly done, especially in households that could afford the fuel and time. But here's the catch. Beer was tastier, nourishing, and easier to keep safe over time. Water, once boiled and cooled, was prone to being contaminated again by storage vessels or environmental exposure. Beer's fermentation gave it a natural shelf life that plain water simply didn't have. Plus, the slight alcohol content helped to mask any lingering unpleasant tastes, making it more palatable and enjoyable. Imagine also the physical sensation of sipping small beer on a chilly morning. It was slightly sweet, lightly fizzy, and comforting, a gentle hug before the rigors of the day. Not only did it provide hydration, but it also lifted spirits and gave a little mental boost. It's no wonder this morning ritual became embedded in daily life. And here's something that might surprise you. This brewing ritual, with its protective qualities, actually saved countless lives. The difference between drinking contaminated water and small beer was often the difference between health and deadly illness. Typhoid, dysentery, and cholera were rampant in medieval communities, all spread through polluted water. By drinking small beer, peasants sidestepped many of these dangers. It's a remarkable example of how a simple, age-old technique protected people long before we understood germs or bacteria. Isn't it fascinating how necessity bred such an ingenious solution? Now, you might be wondering about the actual brewing steps in a bit more detail. The process began with malting barley, soaking the grains to start germination, then drying them to halt it. This activated enzymes that converted starches into sugars, the fuel for yeast. The malted barley was then crushed and mixed with hot water, creating a sugary liquid called wort. This wort was boiled vigorously, killing off any lurking nasties and extracting flavors. After cooling, yeast was added and fermentation began, turning sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide. This resulted in a lightly alcoholic, nutritious beverage ideal for drinking throughout the day. You can almost hear the bubbling of the fermenting wort in the dimly lit kitchens of medieval cottages, the smell of toasted barley filling the air. It was a daily ritual, a rhythm of life intimately connected to survival. Even more, brewing small beer didn't just revolve around health and nutrition, it had economic and social ripple effects. Brewing was a skill passed down through generations, a craft that brought families together. It also created a modest economy in villages, with some peasants brewing extra to trade or sell, adding a small but vital income to their household. So when we think about medieval beer, it's not just a drink, it's a story of human ingenuity, resilience, and community. It's a testament to how ordinary people faced extraordinary challenges with practical wisdom. That morning gulp of small beer was more than a habit. It was a life-saving act wrapped in tradition. And here's the brilliant twist. While today we might associate beer with leisure or weekend socializing, for medieval peasants, it was a lifeline, a daily necessity that kept them hydrated, nourished, and safe from deadly diseases. The brewing process turned risky water into a safe, sustaining elixir. It's a story of science without science, of health without hospitals. So next time you raise a glass, think of those early brewers. Their craft was more than just making a drink. It was a quiet, heroic act. Brewing made beer a safer, more reliable choice than water, and in doing so, it saved lives across centuries. Pause. As we leave behind the bubbling cauldrons and smoke-filled cottages, we'll soon explore another intriguing angle: how this simple beverage shaped social customs and economies in medieval Europe. Believe me, the story of beer goes far beyond the brew itself. But for now, let's savor the wonder of a drink that was, quite literally, life in a cup. You might be wondering, what exactly was this small beer that medieval peasants drank so often? Because let's be honest, calling it beer might bring to mind something quite strong and heady, not a gentle morning companion. But small beer was a very different beast altogether, and understanding it changes everything about why it was such an essential part of daily life back then. Picture this, a busy medieval village just waking up, the sun barely cresting the horizon, and the peasants gathering for their first drink of the day. Instead of reaching for a cup of water, which was often dirty or downright dangerous, they poured themselves a mug of small beer. But this wasn't the kind that would send you staggering about after a couple of pints. No, small beer contained very little alcohol, usually between 0.5% and 2.5%. To put it in perspective, that's far weaker than modern lagers or ales, which are more like 4 to 6%. So, why was small beer made this way? Well, the brewing process itself is quite clever. When peasants brewed beer, they boiled the water as part of the process. Now, boiling water kills off many harmful microorganisms, the ones that made people sick when they drank untreated water from streams or wells. So by turning their water into beer, they were basically disinfecting it without even realizing it. It was safer to drink than just plain water, which was often contaminated with all sorts of nasties. But here's the brilliant part. Because small beer had such a low alcohol content, it wasn't intoxicating in the way we usually think of beer. Instead, it was more like a refreshing,
lightly fermented drink that could be consumed throughout the day at breakfast, lunch, and dinner without risk of getting drunk. In fact, for many peasants, it was the safest and most nourishing drink available. Now, you might be thinking, surely this small beer couldn't have provided much in the way of nutrition. You'd be surprised. While it wasn't a meal in itself, small beer did offer some vital benefits. During fermentation, yeast works its magic, breaking down sugars and releasing B vitamins, which are crucial for energy and overall health. It also contained carbohydrates, which are the body's main fuel source, especially important for hard physical labor. Imagine spending your day working the fields, digging, planting, harvesting. Your body absolutely needs constant energy. Small beer helped provide that, acting almost like a liquid bread. And because it was mostly water, it also kept people hydrated. That's something we often forget. Working outdoors is thirsty work, and clean water was a luxury. Small beer was a perfect solution, a hydrating, nourishing, and safe drink all in one. What's more, the alcohol in small beer, although low, still helped to stave off some bacteria after drinking, offering a further layer of protection. It's like a mild guardian against sickness without the downsides of stronger alcohol that would impair a person's ability to work or function. Here's something quite lovely to imagine. A peasant family sitting around a wooden table early in the morning, sharing mugs of small beer as they prepare for the day. The smell would be subtly malty, a bit sweet, with a gentle fizz from the fermentation. It's not the frothy bitter drink you might picture today. Instead, it's almost like a lightly sparkling, nourishing tonic that's part of daily routine. And small beer wasn't just for peasants. Even monks in monasteries brewed and drank it daily. Monks needed something safe and sustaining for long hours of prayer and work, and small beer fitted the bill perfectly. This wasn't just a rustic habit, it was a widespread practical solution across medieval society. It's quite fascinating to think about how something we might chuckle at today, drinking beer for breakfast, was actually a matter of survival back then. This habit wasn't about indulgence, it was about health and practicality. It was a clever way to sidestep the dangers of contaminated water and keep the body nourished for the demands of the day. Now, the term small beer itself hints at its nature. It wasn't brewed to be strong or fancy. It was often made from second or third runnings, that is, after the first, stronger batch of beer. The leftover brains were brewed again to produce this lighter brew. This recycling not only maximized resources, but also ensured there was always a steady supply of safe drink available. Efficiency was key in those times. What amazed me when reading up on this was how consistently small beer turns up in historical records and archaeological findings. Everyday pottery from medieval sites often includes big, sturdy mugs, signs of daily beer drinking. And written accounts from the period, from tax records to household inventories, mention small beer as a regular staple. It was as common as bread or porridge, a true dietary cornerstone. But there's a subtlety here that we can overlook.
Small beer wasn't just about the physical benefits. It was woven into the social fabric of the time. Sharing a mug of small beer was part of daily life, a communal moment before heading off to toil in the fields or workshops. It was comforting, familiar and reliable, a little ritual that grounded people amid the uncertainties of medieval life. And if you consider the alternatives, plain water, often a gamble with deadly consequences, and strong ale or wine, which were either too expensive or too intoxicating for daily use, small beer was a perfect middle ground. It was the right balance of safety, nutrition, and sobriety. Here's an interesting twist. Small beer's low alcohol content meant it could be drunk by children as well. In a world where clean water was scarce and diseases were rampant, this was a quiet but significant advantage. It gave young bodies a safe, hydrating drink that also helped keep illness at bay. I can't help but admire the practical wisdom embedded in this medieval custom. Without knowing the science we understand today, peasants and brewers worked out a way to protect their health through the brewing process, a testament to human ingenuity in the face of hardship. So the next time you think of beer, don't just picture a pint down at the local pub. Think back to small beer, the humble, life-saving brew that was more tonic than tipple. It was a daily elixir, quietly sustaining millions through tough times, keeping them hydrated, fed, and healthier than they might otherwise have been. And it's worth reflecting on how something as simple as boiling water and fermenting grain made such a huge difference, a reminder that sometimes the most ordinary things can be extraordinary when life depends on them. Now, as we wrap our heads around small beer, it opens up a whole new way to understand medieval life. It's not just about superstition or strange habits. It's about clever solutions, survival strategies, and a fascinating glimpse into the past. And here's where it gets even more intriguing. Small beer wasn't just a drink, but a social glue, a nutritional aid, and a health safeguard all at once. It's a wonderful example of how something so modest could have such a huge impact on daily life and survival. So as we imagine those early morning mugs, the warmth in the chill air, the quiet clink of pottery, and the shared comfort of a safe, nourishing drink, we begin to see medieval peasants not just as distant figures in history, but as people relying on their own clever ways to face life's challenges. Now, if you thought small beer was simply a weaker version of modern beer, think again. It was a carefully crafted, essential part of the medieval diet, a lifeline really, designed to keep people going through long, hard days. And with that understanding, we're ready to explore the next chapter, how this humble drink didn't just save lives by keeping people healthy, but also shaped the social and economic rhythms of medieval communities. Because small beer was more than just a drink, it was a vital thread in the fabric of medieval life. So, let's keep going and uncover how this everyday habit of drinking small beer actually changed history in ways you might never have imagined. Imagine waking up before dawn, the chilly air biting at your skin as you prepare for a long day of hard labor in the fields. Your hands ache already, and you know the hours ahead will be grueling. Now, picture the breakfast laid before you, not a bowl of porridge or a hot cup of tea, but a humble mug of small beer. Strange, isn't it? Yet this was the reality for countless medieval peasants, and not just a cozy tradition. They depended on that very beer to keep them going.
You might be wondering, how on earth could beer, even a weak one,
be a suitable start to such a demanding day. It turns out, small beer was far more than a comforting morning drink. It was a crucial source of nourishment, hydration, and energy. Let's unravel why. First off, small beer was brewed with a lower alcohol content than the ale or stout we're familiar with today, usually between 0.5% and 2.5%. This mildness made it safe to drink throughout the day without causing intoxication. But more importantly, it contained essential carbohydrates that acted much like the energy bars or sports drinks we might reach for now. Carbohydrates are the body's primary fuel source, especially when you're bent double in the fields wielding a scythe or hauling heavy loads. Think of it like this. Imagine trying to power a lorry on nothing but water. It just wouldn't run. The body's muscles are a bit like that lorry. They need fuel. Small beer supplied these vital calories, providing a steady stream of energy that helped peasants keep going hour after hour. This wasn't just a nice to have, it was absolutely essential. But here's where it gets fascinating. The brewing process itself bestowed small beer with more than just empty calories. As the yeast fermented the sugars in the malted barley, it produced not only alcohol, but also a modest amount of B vitamins, including B1, B2, and B3. These vitamins play pivotal roles in energy metabolism, helping the body convert food into usable power. In a time when diets were often limited and lacking in variety, these small nutritional bonuses were incredibly valuable. Now, it might be tempting to picture medieval peasants surviving on beer alone, but of course, their meals included bread, some pottage, and occasionally root vegetables or cabbage. Still, the beer complemented their diet brilliantly, filling in nutritional gaps and ensuring sustained energy release. It was a clever adaptation to the harsh realities of their lives. What about hydration? Surely drinking beer first thing in the morning wouldn't keep you properly watered, right? Well, small beer had a surprisingly important role here too. Because it was mostly water, and its low alcohol content meant it didn't dehydrate drinkers like stronger alcohols do, it was an effective way to maintain hydration during physically demanding work. Remember, clean water was often a scarce or dangerous commodity in medieval villages, rife with bacteria and parasites. Small beer was boiled during brewing, killing off many harmful pathogens, making it safer to drink than the local well water. Picture a peasant stepping out at dawn, lifting his wooden mug of small beer to his lips. The cool liquid is slightly sweet, with a gentle hint of malt and a faint tang from fermentation. As it slides down, it's not just quenching thirst, but also providing the calories and nutrients needed to get through a day filled with back-breaking tasks. There's no buzz or dizziness, just a quiet, steady boost, like the gentle hum of a well-tuned engine. Interestingly, archaeological evidence and historical records back this up. Excavations of medieval settlements have uncovered countless fragments of pottery and tankards, suggesting beer was a daily staple, consumed multiple times throughout the day. Written accounts from the period also mention the importance of small beer as a household necessity, particularly among the working classes. But it wasn't just about survival. There was a social aspect too. Sharing a mug of small beer was part of the rhythm of daily life, a small moment of camaraderie before the toil began. It connected communities, forged bonds, and offered comfort in a world that comforts were few and far between. It's worth pausing here to marvel at how something as ordinary as small beer could carry so much weight, literally and figuratively, in the lives of medieval peasants. It wasn't a luxury, nor simply a preference. It was a carefully evolved solution to the challenge of staying nourished and healthy in tough conditions. Now, you might be curious about the protein content. While small beer wasn't a significant source, it did contain some, thanks to the malted grains used in brewing. Every little bit helped, especially since protein was precious and often scarce in peasant diets. In times when meat was a rare treat, even a small contribution from their daily drinks mattered. And here's a thought. The modest alcohol present in small beer, while not enough to intoxicate, may have had mild antiseptic effects, helping to preserve the drink and keep it safe for consumption throughout the day. This, combined with the nutritional benefits, made small beer a remarkably well-rounded choice, not just a drink, but a practical life support system. So, when we look beyond the stereotype of medieval peasants as simply poor and struggling, we see a community that adapted ingeniously to their environment. They harnessed the science of fermentation long before modern microbiology to create a drink that kept disease at bay, fueled their bodies, and hydrated their spirits. It's a reminder that survival often comes down to small but vital details. The modest mug of small beer at breakfast was more than a quirk of history. It was a lifeline that enabled peasants to endure, to work, and to build the foundations of the society we know today. Before we move on, here's a question for you. Knowing what we do about small beer's nutritional punch, how might our own eating and drinking habits be influenced if we embraced some of these ancient traditions? Would a morning beverage focused on slow energy release and hydration make a difference in our daily lives? Something to ponder while we sip our modern coffee or tea. Now, as we've seen, small beer was a clever blend of nutrition and safety packed into a humble drink. But what about the science behind how this brew actually killed off the nasties lurking in water? And how did these brewing traditions shape the social fabric of medieval villages? That's exactly where we're headed next, uncovering the remarkable brewing process itself and the ripple effects it had beyond just breakfast mugs. Stick with me, because the story of medieval beer is full of surprises, and we've only just begun to scratch the surface. Picture this scene. The first light of dawn barely breaking through a narrow thatched window. Outside, the air is crisp, tinged with the earthy smell of dew on fields and the distant lowing of cattle. Inside, a humble cottage, a peasant stirs awake. What's the very first thing on their mind? Not a steaming cup of tea or a quick sip of water. Instead, it's a small, humble jug of beer. Yes, beer. But not the kind we think of today. This was small beer, a low-alcohol brew, usually around 1 to 2%, barely enough to make your head spin. Yet it was the lifeblood of a medieval peasant's day. It was their morning companion, their midday refresher, and their evening comfort. And if you think that sounds odd, well, you're not alone. But here's where it gets fascinating. This was no mere habit or luxury. It was a crucial part of survival. Imagine waking up after a long night, your body tired and hungry from the hard labor that the day before demanded. For a peasant, the day's work was relentless, tending fields, hauling wood, repairing fences, or milling grain. Each task drained energy, and nutrition was vital. But water? Well, that was a gamble. Rivers and wells were often polluted, carrying diseases that could bring a whole village to its knees. Drinking untreated water was risky. So how did peasants quench their thirst safely? The answer was right in front of them. Beer. The brewing process, you see, involved boiling the water. That was no small thing. Boiling killed off the nasty pathogens lurking in the water, bacteria that could cause cholera or diarrhea. Fermentation added another layer of protection, creating an environment unfriendly to harmful microbes. So while water was a possible carrier of disease, beer was a safer alternative. This wasn't just a preference, it was life-saving. Now, let's wander through a typical day to see how beer fitted into life. As the peasant rises, the first task, after a quick word with the family, is to pour a small cup of beer. This is the breakfast drink, providing not just hydration, but a modest hit of calories and nutrients. Small beer contained carbohydrates from the malted grains, some B vitamins produced during fermentation, and a little protein. It was a liquid snack, a fuel for the body before the back-breaking work began. By mid-morning, the toil in the fields or workshops is well underway. The sun climbs high, and the work only intensifies. Here's where beer makes another appearance, often drunk alongside a simple meal or sometimes on its own to stave off exhaustion and dehydration. Remember, peasants didn't have the luxury of energy bars or smoothies. Their stamina came from whatever they could scrounge, and small beer was a steady source of slow-release energy. It was light enough to not dull the senses, but nourishing enough to keep muscles moving. But here's the remarkable thing. Beer was so embedded in daily life that drinking it wasn't seen as a special treat. It was just normal. In fact, not having your beer could feel as strange as missing your morning cuppa to us today. It was a cultural rhythm, as natural as the chime of the village bell or the crowing of a rooster. Come lunchtime,
The peasants might gather in the shade of a tree or a simple wooden shelter. Their meal was modest, perhaps coarse bread, some cheese or pottage, nothing extravagant. But alongside it flowed more small beer. It refreshed, it soothed parched throats, and it continued to supply vital nutrients. It was the constant, quietly reliable presence that kept them going. By late afternoon, when the work's pace slows a little, the beer again steps into the spotlight. It's a chance to relax, to share a moment with neighbors, to swap stories or news of the day. Here, beer also served a social purpose, binding the community together through shared rituals. It was both nutritional and cultural glue. When evening descends and the workday finally ends, the peasant returns home weary but sustained. Dinner is a simple affair, often similar to lunch, but the beer is still poured. This last drink of the day is not just about nourishment, it offers comfort. The warmth of the small beer, the gentle buzz of its low alcohol content helps ease the body into rest. It's a moment of peace after a day of hard labor. You might wonder, with all this drinking, how did they avoid drunkenness? That was the beauty of small beer. It was weak enough to be drunk throughout the day without causing significant intoxication. It was the perfect balance. Enough alcohol to keep the brew safe and palatable, but not enough to impair the laborer's ability to work. So, peasants could drink it regularly, often several pints a day, and still get on with their demanding tasks. But beyond safety and nutrition, the beer habit tells us something deeper about medieval life. It reveals how people adapted cleverly to their environment, making use of available resources to protect themselves. It shows us a society where survival depended on the simplest, most practical choices. And it highlights an often overlooked part of history, the everyday lives of ordinary people who, through their customs, shape the course of life itself. It's also worth noting how beer's role was influenced by social and economic realities. Brewing was often done at home or by local inns, making it accessible and affordable. Peasants didn't rely on expensive imports or rare luxuries. Their beer was a product of their land, their labor, and their traditions. This made it all the more vital. Let's take a moment to reflect on the sensory world of the medieval peasant's beer. It wasn't the polished, crystal clear pint we might expect today. Small beer was often cloudy, earthy, and a little sour, with a malty aroma and a faint sweetness. It was a far cry from modern lagers, but deeply satisfying in its own rustic way. Drinking it meant tasting the very soil, the grains, the yeast, an intimate connection with the land and labor that produced it. And here's a thought that might surprise you. Despite its humble status, this beer was a nutritional powerhouse for the peasant. The carbohydrates gave energy, the small protein content helped repair muscles, and the B vitamins, essential for metabolism, were a bonus. In a time when diets were limited and often monotonous, small beer was a rare, reliable source of these essentials. As we walk through this day together, it becomes clear that beer was far from a frivolous indulgence. It was a cornerstone of survival, woven into every meal, every break, every moment of rest. It offered safety from disease, nourishment for hard work, and a sense of comfort in a tough world. So next time you pour yourself a pint, consider this. The simple act of drinking beer at breakfast wasn't just a quirk of history. It was a brilliant, practical solution that helped medieval peasants live to see another day. It's a reminder that sometimes the oddest habits have the most extraordinary stories behind them. And as our day in the life of a medieval peasant draws to a close, with that final sip of small beer calming the spirit, we begin to glimpse the resilience and resourcefulness of these ordinary folk. Their mornings, afternoons, and evenings all marked by the gentle presence of beer, a drink that saved lives, shaped culture, and kept a hard-working population going against all odds. Now, as we pause here, ready to explore what other mysteries and marvels await, ask yourself, what other everyday things in history might hold incredible secrets just waiting to be uncovered? Let's keep this curiosity alive as we move on. But for now, imagine the taste of that small beer, the warmth of the hearth, and the quiet strength of a medieval peasant's day. It's a story that's more than just history. It's a glimpse into human ingenuity and survival. And it's truly something worth savoring. Now, imagine stepping back in time to a modest medieval village where the daily rhythm is simple but tough. The peasantry rise at dawn, not to the smell of freshly brewed coffee or the rustle of a tea bag, but the earthy scent of barley and malt. It might sound odd to us now, but beer was their morning companion. What evidence do we have that this wasn't just a passing fad, but an ingrained part of their lives? Well, that's exactly where the real magic of history and archaeology comes in. It's one thing to guess or imagine, but quite another to hold the tangible proof in your hands, or rather, to uncover it from the dirt beneath centuries of forgotten lives. Picture a typical medieval peasant's home. Simple timber walls, a hearth that's rarely extinguished, and the tools of daily survival scattered about. Archaeologists, those intrepid detectives of the past, have dug up numerous such homes, revealing more than just pottery shards or old nails. Among the finds, they've uncovered tiny fragments of brewing equipment, clay vessels with telltale residues of barley and hops. These aren't just any stains. Chemical analysis confirms they're the remnants of beer, and not just a one-off batch, but evidence of regular brewing. It's quite extraordinary, really. Finding these brewing remnants inside homes, rather than just in communal spaces or monasteries, tells us that beer was brewed on site, often by the women of the household. Brewing wasn't some grand industrial process, but a daily, domestic affair. The smell of malt would have been as familiar as the morning sun. But what's even more revealing is that these vessels show signs of repeated use, hinting at a continuous supply of beer, not an occasional treat. Now, here's where it gets fascinating. Alongside these physical clues, medieval texts, the written word itself, offer us another layer of proof. Records from the time, whether in monastic chronicles or legal documents, frequently mention small beer and its role in everyday life. One particular text from the 13th century talks about peasants receiving daily rations of small beer as part of their wages. Imagine, your daily sustenance included not just bread or pottage, but a steady flow of this low-alcohol beer. It wasn't just a drink, it was a vital source of nutrition and health. But what exactly was this small beer? It's important to clarify that it wasn't the hefty pint we might picture today. Small beer typically contained between 0.5 and 2.5% alcohol, enough to kill harmful microbes, but mild enough to drink throughout the day without intoxicating effects. This was crucial because water sources were often polluted, and drinking untreated water was a gamble with life-threatening diseases. The boiling stage in the brewing process effectively sterilized the liquid, making it safer than any water from a nearby stream or well. Archaeological digs have even uncovered old brewing vessels with tiny amounts of the yeast and bacteria that contributed to fermentation. It's like peering into the biochemical soul of the beer itself. This fermentation didn't just produce alcohol, it also created vitamins, especially those from the B group, and provided carbohydrates and a small amount of protein. For a hard-working peasant, these nutrients were a godsend, fueling their labor from sunrise to sunset. Historical records also link beer to improved health outcomes. For example, some medieval town accounts note fewer outbreaks of waterborne diseases in populations with access to regular beer rations. It's tempting to think of beer merely as a leisure drink, but for the peasantry, it was closer to medicine, an essential safeguard that helped them survive harsh conditions. One particularly vivid account from a 13th century manor rolls off the tongue like a whisper from the past. It describes how the manor's laborers were issued a gallon of small beer each morning, a practice that not only quenched thirst, but kept the body hardy and ready for toil. It's a phrase that paints a picture of beer as a lifeline, a daily ritual that wasn't about indulgence, but about survival. There's also a social dimension to all this. Brewing and beer drinking were communal activities, reinforcing bonds within the village. The shared knowledge of brewing techniques and the daily exchange of fresh beer created a rhythm of connection. It's no coincidence that many medieval celebrations, fairs, and gatherings featured beer as a staple, not just for merriment, but as a nutritional cornerstone.
And here's a little nugget that often surprises people. In some parts of medieval Europe, the presence of brewing tools in a household was so common that it's almost as if every peasant family had their own microbrewery. Archaeologists have found brewing pits and clay pots in even the humblest cottages, which suggests that beer wasn't a luxury for the few, but an everyday necessity for the many. Of course, this wasn't just about drinking for the sake of it. The grueling physical demands placed on peasants, plowing fields, harvesting crops, carrying heavy loads, required a steady stream of calories and hydration. Beer provided both. Unlike water, which could be dangerously contaminated, or foodstuffs that might spoil, beer was a reliable source of energy and moisture. Its carbohydrates offered quick fuel, while its relatively low alcohol content meant it didn't dehydrate, but actually helped maintain fluid balance. Now, I mentioned earlier that we have both archaeological and textual evidence. When these two lines of inquiry come together, the picture becomes beautifully clear. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. The tools and residues unearthed beneath the soil fit perfectly with the written accounts describing daily beer rations and brewing customs. This convergence confirms that beer was deeply woven into the fabric of peasant life. You might wonder, though, how widespread was this practice? Was it just a local quirk or a pan-European phenomenon? The answer lies in the distribution of these finds and texts. Excavations across England, Germany, and even parts of Scandinavia reveal similar patterns. Brewing equipment is found in village homes alongside evidence of barley cultivation and storage. Writings from various regions consistently mention small beer as a dietary staple. This widespread occurrence tells us that the beer habit wasn't confined to one corner of medieval Europe, but was a common solution to shared problems, contaminated water, and the need for sustenance. Here's a striking detail. Some brewing vessels show signs of repairs, indicating that they were valued possessions, carefully mended and reused over years. This speaks volumes about the importance of beer in daily life. These pots weren't simply disposable containers. They were essential tools, much like a modern kettle or teapot. And as the years ticked by, this tradition didn't just vanish. The custom of drinking small beer, passed down through generations, shaped not just diets, but social customs. Even into Tudor times, records show that beer remained a staple for the working classes, gradually evolving but never losing its foundational role. So, When we look back at medieval peasants and their morning beer, it's not just a quaint curiosity, it's a story grounded in hard evidence. Pots dug up from ancient earth, words inked on fragile parchment, and the unmistakable legacy of a beverage that saved lives. Their mornings began not with uncertainty about water safety, but with a dependable, nourishing drink crafted from barley and fire, brewed with care in the heart of the home. As we reflect on this, it's quite humbling to realize how something as simple as beer was a lifeline, a shield against sickness, and a source of daily strength. It reshapes the way we think about history, not as dusty dates and distant kings, but as the lived experience of people who, against all odds, found ways to survive and thrive. And now, having uncovered this rich tapestry of evidence, we're poised to explore what this all meant for the peasants' health and how the humble small beer truly saved lives in the chapters ahead. But before we do, take a moment to picture those early mornings, the warm glow of the hearth, the faint hiss of brewing, and the comforting sip of a drink that was far more than just a beverage. It was survival in a cup. Ready to see how this fascinating habit impacted medieval health and nutrition? Well, stay with me because the story is far from over. Picture this. You're a medieval peasant, waking up just as the first light creeps over the horizon. The day ahead promises back-breaking toil in the fields, and your body demands something to sustain it. Now, you might expect water to be the obvious choice for a morning drink, right? But here's the twist. Water was often a dangerous gamble. Contaminated wells and streams teemed with invisible killers like cholera, dysentery, and typhoid. These diseases were the silent predators lurking in every village, ready to strike down the unwary. No wonder medieval peasants reached instead for their morning pint of beer. You see, the brewing process wasn't just about making a tasty tipple, it was a life-saving ritual. When you boil the water during brewing, you're effectively killing off countless harmful bacteria that would otherwise make you gravely ill. In an age before soap, sanitation, or germ theory, this simple step made beer far safer than any unboiled water source. It's quite remarkable, really, to think that brewing was an early form of hygiene, a practical, everyday shield against disease. Now, you might think that the peasants were just getting a pick-me-up before the day's labor, but the benefits were far deeper. The carbohydrates, B vitamins, and tiny amounts of protein in beer helped fuel those long, grueling hours in the fields. It was like a medieval energy drink, but one that also protected against deadly illnesses. So beer wasn't simply a comfort or a treat, it was a crucial part of their diet and health. Historians have uncovered records showing that peasants consumed small beer multiple times a day. It was accepted as a norm, not a luxury. This wasn't about drunkenness, it was about survival. Drinking water straight from the river or well was simply too risky. And bottled water, that was centuries away. So beer filled the gap, silently reducing the prevalence of deadly diseases. Imagine the scale of this impact. In towns and villages where beer was brewed and consumed regularly, outbreaks of cholera and typhoid were less frequent and devastating. In some cases, archaeological evidence of mass deaths aligns with periods when brewing was disrupted due to war or famine. This connection between beer and health becomes even clearer when you consider that brewing took place almost everywhere, from large towns to small rural communities. It was an essential, widespread practice. But the story isn't just about biology and chemistry. It's about how a simple habit shaped the lives and well-being of millions. Think about the social and economic pressures of the time. Peasants worked hard from dawn to dusk, often with little food. They needed a source of energy and hydration that was affordable and accessible. Beer fit the bill perfectly. Not only did it stave off illness, but it also kept workers productive and alive.
supporting the entire feudal economy. Without this daily ritual, many might have succumbed to disease early on, leaving families and communities weakened. Here's a little-known fact that might surprise you. Before the germ theory of disease was established in the 19th century, people had no clear idea what caused illnesses. Yet the practice of drinking small beer was a wise, if accidental, response to their environment. It's a testament to human ingenuity and adaptation that such a simple process could stand between life and death. They didn't need to understand microbes to know that drinking water itself was risky, so they reached for beer instead. And it wasn't just peasants who benefited. Even monks and nobles drank small beer regularly, though often their brews were stronger or more refined. This widespread consumption further highlights how crucial beer was to medieval society. It was woven into daily routines, festivals, and even religious ceremonies. Yet for the peasants, it was a matter of survival, a morning companion that carried them through perilous times. Now, you might be wondering about the taste. Surely a low-alcohol beer first thing in the morning wouldn't be very pleasant. Actually, small beer was quite mild and refreshing, often slightly sour or sweet depending on the brewing method. It was a far cry from the stronger ales or stouts we might think of today. The drink was designed to be quenching and easy on the stomach, perfect for repeated consumption throughout the day. Imagine the smell of malt and hops wafting from the brewery, mingling with the earthy scents of hay and soil, a comforting aroma signaling safety and nourishment. Of course, we can't talk about beer without touching on the cultural aspect. This daily habit was part of a shared identity among peasants. It fostered community, camaraderie, and even a little joy amidst hardship. Brewing was often a communal affair, with knowledge passed down through generations. The humble pint wasn't just a drink, it was a symbol of resilience. Now, here's a thought to leave you with. What if modern society could learn something from this? In an age where we obsess over bottled water and energy drinks, the medieval approach reminds us that simple, traditional practices can have profound health benefits, even when we don't fully understand why. The peasant's beer habit might seem quaint or odd, but it was a remarkable solution to a deadly problem.
Before we move on to the next chapter, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Did you ever imagine beer could be so crucial to survival? Or perhaps you've tried a small beer-style brew yourself. Drop your thoughts in the comments. It's always fascinating to hear your perspective on these little-known pieces of history. So, as we raise our imaginary tankards to the medieval peasants, let's remember that their morning beer was far more than a drink. It was a shield, a fuel, and a lifeline. Next up, we'll explore how this tradition influenced social life and economy in ways you might never have guessed. Stay with me. The story's only getting richer from here. Picture this: a humble medieval village waking up to the soft light of dawn, the air still crisp and cool. The smell of wood smoke lingers, and from the small cottages, the clinking of wooden mugs can be heard. But here's the twist. Those mugs aren't filled with tea or even water, but beer. Not some fancy, heady ale, but the everyday, mild, small beer that was the lifeblood of these communities. Now, why was beer so deeply woven into the social and economic fabric of peasant life? What made it so accessible, so utterly essential, that it became a staple from the very first moment of the day? Let's take a wander through those muddy lanes of history and uncover the reasons behind this curious habit. First off, it's important to understand that brewing beer in the medieval period wasn't the exclusive domain of large breweries or wealthy lords. Far from it. Brewing was a craft practiced right at home,
in small village kitchens and community halls. For most peasants, making beer was as routine as baking bread. The process was straightforward enough. Boil water, add malted grains, let it ferment. Simple, familiar steps handed down through generations. Imagine a family kitchen in the village. A large wooden barrel sits quietly in the corner, bubbling gently as the brew ferments. The smell is faintly sweet, a hint of malt and yeast that promises comfort and sustenance. Brewing was often a communal affair, with knowledge shared between neighbors and relatives. It was a craft that didn't require fancy equipment or secret ingredients, just time, patience, and a few basics that were easy to source. This home-brewed nature of beer meant it was incredibly affordable. Unlike wine, which was the luxury of nobles and clergy, or imported spirits that were costly and rare, small beer was within the reach of anyone with a grain store and a fire. It was the people's drink, made by the people for the people. And here's something fascinating. In many villages, public brewing was even organized at the community level. The local alehouse wasn't just a place to drink. It was a social hub where brewers and drinkers exchanged stories, recipes, and tips. But affordability wasn't the only factor. Beer was also reliable, something that water simply wasn't. Rivers and wells were often contaminated, carrying all manner of diseases. So brewing beer, which involved boiling the water and fermenting it, essentially sterilized it, making the end result far safer to drink. This wasn't just about taste or tradition, it was survival. Now, consider the economic realities of the time. Peasants worked incredibly hard during long, grueling days in the fields. Their bodies demanded constant nourishment and hydration to keep going. Beer, with its carbohydrates, small amounts of protein, and B vitamins from fermentation, was a perfect energy source. It was liquid bread, really, a filling, sustaining drink that could be consumed throughout the day without the risk of intoxication thanks to its low alcohol content. This brings me to the heart of the matter. Beer was part of a deeply ingrained cultural tradition. Drinking small beer at breakfast, midday, and evening wasn't just a quirk, it was a custom reinforced by social norms and economic necessity. It created a sense of shared identity among peasants, binding communities not just through work, but through daily rituals. You might wonder, how did this tradition survive so strongly? Well, it wasn't just about the drink itself, but what it represented. Brewing and drinking beer was woven into the rhythm of rural life, a reassuring constant amidst uncertainty. It was something peasants could control, a small comfort in a world often harsh and unpredictable. The alehouse was where news was exchanged, deals were struck, and friendships forged. In a way, beer was the social glue of medieval village life. Here's a delightful detail. In some regions, brewing was considered so important that laws were made to regulate it. These weren't restrictions to make life difficult, but measures to ensure quality and fairness. Everyone depended on the beer, so it had to be good and affordable. This level of regulation shows just how vital beer was to everyday life, far beyond mere indulgence. And it's worth noting the role of women in this story. Brewing was often the work of the household's womenfolk, who combined it with other chores. They were the guardians of recipes, the keepers of fermentation secrets, and the first brewers in the village. Their skill ensured that every morning's pint was ready to start the day safely and effectively. This gives us a glimpse into the domestic and social dynamics of medieval society, where beer was both a necessity and a craft. Now, let's think about the wider economic impact. Brewing created a small but steady demand for barley and other grains, which meant farmers had a reliable market for their crops. In turn, this encouraged agricultural stability and even some degree of surplus production. Beer was, in some sense, a quiet engine of rural economy, supporting not just the drinkers, but the growers, the millers, and the coopers who made barrels. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Despite its humble beginnings, beer was also a currency of sorts. It was used to pay workers, a sort of liquid wage for laboring peasants. Instead of coins, many would receive a daily ration of small beer as part of their compensation. So the drink wasn't just nourishment, it was part of the economic exchange system, an everyday commodity that had real value. And because of its central place in life, beer even shaped social interactions and hierarchies. The alehouse was a level playing field where peasants, craftsmen, and even sometimes minor officials mingled. It was a place where news, gossip, and ideas flowed as freely as the beer itself. In this way, beer helped knit together the social fabric of villages, offering a space for community cohesion and collective identity. Now, here's a question for you. Have you ever thought about how something as simple as a morning drink could carry such weight? Not just in terms of health, but culture, economy, and social life? It's quite remarkable when you stop to consider it. Beer wasn't just a drink, it was a lifeline, a shared ritual, and a form of connection. This tradition also tells us a lot about resilience. Peasants faced many hardships, famine, disease, harsh weather, but they adapted in ways that might not be obvious at first glance. Brewing their own beer was a clever, practical solution to a very real problem: how to stay hydrated and nourished in a world without clean water. It's a testament to human ingenuity and community spirit. And it's this very resilience that allowed the custom to endure. Even as centuries passed and technology advanced, the echo of these early brewing traditions remains. We see it in local ales, village fairs, and the continuing affection for beer as a drink of the people. So, as we sip our modern cup of tea or coffee, let's spare a thought for those medieval villagers raising their mugs of small beer at dawn. Their morning habit wasn't just a quirky tradition, it was a vital practice born from necessity, shaped by community, and sustained by culture. And just as we've uncovered these fascinating threads today, next time we'll explore the very science behind why small beer was so good for them, how the magic of fermentation turned grains and water into a life-saving brew. You won't want to miss it. Until then, keep wondering about the little things in history that reveal so much about who we are and where we come from.
Imagine a medieval village long before the clatter of steel or the bustle of market day. It's dawn, and the mist still lingers over fields where peasants will soon toil. Somewhere in a modest cottage, the day's brewing is underway, a tradition passed down through generations, quietly shaping lives in ways we might scarcely imagine today. What's remarkable is not just that beer was their morning drink, but how the very techniques used to make it became a shield against sickness, a lifeline etched into the daily rhythm of their lives. Now, here's where it gets fascinating. The safety of medieval beer wasn't an accident. It was the result of carefully honed methods, brewing rituals that were as much about survival as they were about flavor. The secret lay largely in two key processes: boiling and fermentation. These might sound like simple steps to us now, but back then, they were nothing short of revolutionary. First, boiling. Imagine this. Peasants would take water from wells or nearby streams, water that was often muddy, sometimes downright dangerous. The risk of disease was very real, with waterborne illnesses lurking unseen. But by boiling this water during brewing, they effectively wiped out countless harmful microorganisms. It was a crucial step, like nature's own sterilizer, and it turned a potentially deadly drink into something far safer. This wasn't some scientific breakthrough taught in universities, it was a practical wisdom born from necessity, passed along through countless mornings of brewing. And then there's fermentation. This process, where yeast works its magic on sugars to create alcohol and carbon dioxide, did more than just give the beer its slight kick and fizz. Fermentation produced natural acids and alcohol, both of which helped keep harmful bacteria at bay. When you think about it, this was an early form of preservation long before fridges or preservatives existed. The yeast's humble work ensured the beer remained safe to drink for days, even weeks. It's no surprise that small beer, a low alcohol brew, usually ranging between 0.5% and 2.5% alcohol, was such a staple. Light enough not to dull the senses, but robust enough to protect and nourish. What's truly captivating is how these brewing methods were more than just processes. They were family heirlooms. Recipes and techniques weren't scribbled down in books for the masses. They were whispered from one generation to the next, often within the same household. Mothers taught daughters, fathers guided sons, and whole communities shared their brewing wisdom. This oral tradition ensured a consistency, not only in flavor, but in safety. Each family's brew bore their own subtle mark, a blend of local ingredients and personal know-how, but always with the same goal, to nourish and protect. Imagine the scene inside a peasant's kitchen. Large wooden vats bubbling gently, the warm smell of malt and hops filling the air, a comforting scent mingling with the morning chill. The brewer would carefully time the boiling, watch the foam rise as the sugars broke down, and then patiently wait for the yeast to do its work. It was a labor of love and discipline, a ritual that gave structure to the day. And here's the thing, this wasn't just about making something to drink, it was about making something reliable, something that could keep families alive through the hardships of medieval life. And speaking of hardships, consider the ever-present threat of illness. Medieval Europe was rife with disease, many of which were linked directly to contaminated water supplies. Without modern sanitation, drinking untreated water was a gamble, often with deadly consequences. But the brewing process, with its boiling and fermentation, acted as a barrier, preventing these diseases from taking hold. Historical records and archaeological digs have shown that beer-drinking peasants had notably fewer waterborne illnesses. It's almost as if every morning's brew was a small act of defiance against the invisible dangers lurking in their environment. But how did they keep the beer from spoiling? After all, without refrigeration, food and drink could turn sour quickly. The answer lies partly in those very same brewing techniques. Boiling killed off microbes that could cause spoilage, while fermentation produced natural preservatives. Plus, small beer's low alcohol content was just enough to deter harmful bacteria without making the drink too intoxicating for daily consumption. It was an elegant balance, enough alcohol to protect, but light enough to sustain. And here's a lovely detail. The ingredients themselves contributed to the beer's safety and nourishment. Barley and malt provided carbohydrates, essential fuel for tiring bodies, and fermentation added small amounts of protein and B vitamins. So this wasn't just a safer drink, it was a nourishing one, perfectly suited to the demands of manual labor. Peasants working long hours in the field needed steady energy, and the beer quietly delivered. The consistency of brewing techniques also had a social side. Brewing was often a communal affair, a chance to gather, share stories, and reinforce bonds. In many villages, the local alehouse or communal brewing spot was a hub of activity. Families and neighbors exchanged tips, swapped recipes, and kept traditions alive. This social fabric meant that good brewing practices spread more widely, increasing the overall health and well-being of the community. What began as a practical measure to ensure safe drinking water became woven deeply into the culture. Now I'd like you to think about the sheer resilience this reflects. Imagine living in a world where every sip of water could spell disaster, yet these people, through generations of trial and error, found a way to transform a humble grain into a life-saving elixir. That's not just brewing, that's ingenuity meeting necessity head-on. And what's beautiful about these techniques is their lasting legacy. Many of the brewing techniques developed in those early days have echoed down through centuries, influencing beer making even now. The very idea of boiling the wort, carefully controlling fermentation, and using specific grains and hops comes straight from those medieval traditions. So when we raise a glass today, there's a connection, a thread that ties us back to those early brewers who, without modern science, crafted a drink that was both nourishing and protective. But here's a question for you. Next time you enjoy a pint, do you ever wonder about the story behind it? About the centuries of hands that shaped its making and the lives it quietly saved along the way? It's a humbling thought, isn't it? That what might seem like an everyday pleasure has roots tangled deep in history and human survival. As we wrap up our look at these ancient brewing techniques, it's clear they were far more than just recipes. They were lifelines, born out of necessity and refined with care. Through boiling and fermentation, through family secrets and community sharing, medieval peasants crafted a daily ritual that kept disease at bay and provided essential nourishment. It's a testament to their resilience and resourcefulness, a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary stories lie hidden in the simplest of practices. So next time you hear about medieval peasants drinking beer for breakfast, remember it wasn't a strange quirk or mere indulgence. It was a carefully crafted, scientifically sound tradition that saved lives and sustained communities. A practice that deserves more than just a passing glance. It deserves our admiration. And as we move forward, we'll explore how this morning ritual shaped not just health, but social life, economy, and culture, revealing even more surprising ways beer was central to medieval living. Stick around, you won't want to miss what's next. You might have heard some curious tales about medieval peasants and their morning tipple of beer. Perhaps you've pictured them as a bunch of merry drunks, pouring pints at dawn, staggering about in rags, completely off their heads before the sun is even properly up. Or maybe you think they drank beer purely for the buzz, as if it was some kind of party starter, a medieval equivalent of our morning espresso shot. Well, I'm here to set the record straight and bust a few myths that have stuck around for too long.
First off, let's tackle the idea that medieval beer was some strong, heady brew, the kind that would have had peasants wobbling about as they set out to till the fields. Not quite. In reality, the beer they drank, often called small beer, was remarkably mild. We're talking about a drink with an alcohol content anywhere between 0.5 and 2.5%. To put that in perspective, many modern lagers hover around 4 to 5%, sometimes even higher. Small beer was barely enough to get anyone tipsy. It was more like a gentle companion to their morning chores rather than a reckless stimulant. So why did they drink it first thing in the morning? Was it just out of habit, or because it tasted good? The answer is far more practical than that. Water back then was often a sneaky villain. Rivers and wells were frequently contaminated, brimming with harmful bacteria and parasites. Drinking untreated water could lead to dreadful illnesses, dysentery, cholera, and other diseases that we thankfully rarely encounter today. Peasants didn't have the luxury of bottled water or filtration systems, so they turned to what was in fact a lifesaver, beer. And not just any beer, but one brewed with care and boiled during the process, which killed off those nasty pathogens lurking in the water. Imagine the scene, a peasant family rising before dawn, the air crisp and damp with morning mist. The mother sets a pot on the fire, brewing a batch of small beer.
The boiling kills any lurking dangers in the water, turning a potentially deadly sip into a safe, nourishing drink. It's warm, slightly sweet, and packed with enough calories to give the body the energy it needs for backbreaking work. Now, here's another myth that deserves busting. Some reckon that beer was drunk just for fun, as a social indulgence, or even as a form of escapism. But for peasants, beer was far from a frivolous luxury. It was survival in liquid form. The carbohydrates it provided were essential for sustaining the physical demands of daily labor: digging, harvesting, carrying heavy loads. Alongside a diet that was often limited and repetitive, small beer offered vital nutrients like B vitamins and a modest amount of protein from fermentation. It helped keep people both hydrated and fueled. Think of it like this. If you've ever had a long day of physical work, you'll know how important it is to keep your energy up. Today, we might reach for a sports drink or an energy bar. Back then, their equivalent was small beer. It's a fascinating reminder that what seems like a humble, everyday drink held a crucial place in people's diets and well-being. And here's where things get even more interesting. Despite popular modern assumptions, beer in medieval times was actually more hygienic than water. That's a twist, isn't it? We tend to think of beer as a bit naughty, something that's bad for your health if consumed without care. But the brewing process itself, with its boiling step and fermentation, acted as a natural purifier. Water, untreated, was a bit of a gamble, and one that often didn't pay off. Historical records and archaeological evidence back this up. Everyday pots and vessels found at medieval sites bear traces of beer residue, confirming its widespread consumption. Documents from the era often mention small beer as a staple in workers' rations, given because it kept them healthier and more productive. Some historians even credit this regular intake of low-alcohol beer with reducing the spread of waterborne diseases, effectively saving countless lives. So if you thought peasants were staggering around drunk all day, consider this. They were actually drinking a clever, life-saving drink that helped them survive in a challenging world. They weren't indulging in excess, but using what was available to protect their families and communities. Now, you might wonder about the social side of things. Did beer have a place beyond the breakfast table? Absolutely. But even then, it wasn't about getting plastered. It was a communal drink, often shared among family and neighbors, bringing people together in a way that was wholesome as well as practical. It's easy to romanticize the idea of medieval taverns as raucous dens of inebriation, but the reality was more nuanced. Beer was a part of everyday life, woven into the fabric of work, rest, and community. Here's a lovely anecdote to bring this home. In some villages, the local brewhouse was a central hub, not unlike a community center today. People would gather not just to drink, but to exchange news, celebrate festivals, and support one another. The beer itself was often brewed at home or by small-scale local brewers, making it fresh, familiar, and trusted. It was a common thread linking the social and economic lives of people, a real lifeline in more ways than one. All this flips the modern stereotype on its head. Instead of seeing medieval peasants as reckless drinkers, we see them as savvy survivors, making the most of their resources and navigating harsh realities with resilience and ingenuity. Their morning beer habit wasn't a sign of weakness or indulgence, but a practical response to their environment, a liquid shield against illness, a source of nourishment, and a social glue. Before we move on, I want to ask you this. Does it surprise you that something as simple as beer could have had such a big impact on people's health and survival? Sometimes history surprises us by showing that what we might dismiss as commonplace or even frivolous was actually vital. It makes you wonder what everyday things today might be hiding remarkable stories of their own. All right, here's a quick moment for you to reflect. If you had to choose between a glass of water from a murky medieval well or a pint of small beer, which would you fancy? It's a no-brainer for those peasants, isn't it? If you're enjoying uncovering these medieval secrets, don't forget to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you make of this fascinating slice of history. Now, as we wrap up this myth-busting chapter, keep in mind how important it is to look beyond the surface of history. The stories and customs of the past are often misunderstood because we apply our modern lenses without considering the realities people faced back then. Medieval beer wasn't about merriment alone. It was a practical, healthy part of life, a drink that saved more than a few lives in its time. Next up, we'll dive into how the brewing process itself worked, the magic behind transforming water, grain, and yeast into that life-sustaining small beer. We'll explore the science and craft that made it possible, revealing the remarkable knowledge and skills medieval brewers had. It's a tale of craft, culture, and chemistry you won't want to miss. So stick around because the story of medieval beer is far richer and more surprising than any myth could ever capture. Let's continue this fascinating journey together. Picture this scene. A small medieval village, the sun just peeping over the rooftops of thatched cottages, the air cool with early morning mist. Inside one humble home, a family gathers round a large wooden table worn smooth by years of use. But instead of tea or porridge, there's a steaming jug of small beer, weak in alcohol, but rich in warmth and comfort. Now, this isn't just a morning drink. It's the beating heart of their day, their community, and their very survival. You might be wondering, how on earth did beer become more than just a beverage in medieval life? Well, it turns out that drinking beer for breakfast, especially the staple known as small beer, was about far more than just quenching thirst or staving off hunger. It was a deeply social, cultural ritual that brought people together in ways we might not expect today. Let's start with the brewing itself. Brewing beer wasn't some solitary chore done in a distant brewery. For many peasants, it was a communal affair, often centered around the home and family. Imagine the kitchen bustling with activity, a mother tending the malted barley, a father keeping the fire steady under the brewing pot, children running about with a sense of excitement. Brewing was a shared craft, passed down through generations, a skill that bonded families and even whole villages. This wasn't just about making a drink, it was about creating something vital together. After all, beer was life. It provided the calories and nutrients needed for the hard manual labor that defined peasant life. But more than that, it was a daily reminder of interdependence. Everyone played a part, whether stirring the mash or spreading the grain to dry in the sunshine. The process itself was a form of social glue, a collective effort that everyone could take pride in. Now, here's where it gets fascinating. The act of drinking beer was equally social. It wasn't something you did alone in your room. Instead, sharing a jug or a cup of small beer was a ritual that marked the rhythms of daily life. Families started the day with it, but neighbors and friends would also gather throughout the day to partake as well. This shared drinking helped knit communities closer together, reinforcing bonds and offering moments of warmth in otherwise tough, tiring days. Think about the way we might share a coffee or a pint today. It's not just about the drink, it's about the connection. The same was true back then, except beer was woven into the fabric of everyday survival. When peasants convened to share a drink, it was also a chance to exchange news, swap stories, and support one another, both emotionally and practically. Seasonal celebrations, too, often centered around beer. Festivals marking the harvest, religious holidays, or local milestones were punctuated by communal drinking. Brewing for these occasions was an event in itself, sometimes requiring the whole village to come together to prepare enough beer to go around. These moments weren't just about festivity, they reinforced a shared identity and collective strength. In an era where life was precarious, those ties were life-affirming. What's more, beer rituals also had a kind of gentle ceremony attached to them. Different times of the day or year called for different brews or servings. For instance, the morning small beer was light and nourishing, perfect for starting the day's labor, while stronger brews might be reserved for evening or special occasions. These customs gave structure to daily life, a comforting rhythm amid uncertainty. And here's a little detail that really sparks the imagination. Historical records and archaeological finds show that in some villages, beer wasn't just consumed at home. There were communal brewing centers or ale houses where people gathered, not unlike our modern pubs. These places were hubs of social life, buzzing with conversation and camaraderie. They served as meeting points where news was shared, deals struck, and friendships forged. In many ways, the humble alehouse was the medieval community center. Now, you might ask, why beer? Why this rather peculiar drink for breakfast rather than something simpler, like water or juice? Well, as we know, drinking water back then was a gamble at best. Rivers and wells were often contaminated, carrying diseases that could decimate populations. Beer, with its boiling and fermentation process, was far safer. But beyond safety, beer was nourishing. It offered carbohydrates, small amounts of protein, and B vitamins, all essential for the back-breaking work peasants faced. Drinking beer wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity woven into the social fabric. So the simple act of sharing a morning beer was laden with meaning. It was a daily reaffirmation of community, health, and survival. It connected individuals to family, neighbors, and the rhythm of the seasons. In a world without modern conveniences, these small rituals were anchors of stability. Imagine, too, the sensory world of these gatherings. The warmth of the beer in your hand on a crisp morning, the faintly sweet smell of malts lingering in the air, the murmur of voices sharing news or laughter. These moments were pockets of joy and solidarity, a reminder that even under hardship, human connection thrived. What's truly remarkable is how these traditions have shaped our own cultural habits. The medieval morning beer habit laid foundations for social customs that evolved into the pub culture we recognize today. The idea of coming together over a drink to share stories and support one another is timeless. And it all started with those small, humble jugs of beer that kick-started the day. So next time you raise a glass with friends, remember that you're part of a very old story. A story of community, resilience, and survival. The beer wasn't just about the drink itself. It was about what it represented. Togetherness in the face of life's challenges. Now, as we prepare to move on, keep this in mind. The social bonds forged over small beer were as crucial as the drink's health benefits. They created networks of support that helped communities endure and thrive. And that sense of belonging, that shared ritual, is something that has echoed through centuries. Picture this. A crisp morning in a small medieval village, the sun just beginning to stretch its golden fingers over thatched rooftops. The air is fresh, but not quite as clean as we might expect. It carries the earthy scent of damp soil, smoke from chimneys, and yes, a faint hint of brewing malt. Now, the peasants don't reach for a cup of tea or coffee here. Instead, they pour themselves a hearty mug of beer to kick off their day. But this wasn't just a quirky habit. Oh no, it was something far more significant. It was a lifeline, a cornerstone of their economy and survival. You might be wondering, how on earth did beer come to play such a vital role beyond just being a drink? Well, buckle up, because this tale winds through the very fabric of medieval life, weaving together health, economy, and community in a way that still surprises us today. First off, let's consider the economic side of things. Brewing beer wasn't simply about quenching thirst. For many peasants, it was a small-scale enterprise, a craft practiced right at home. Women, often the unsung heroes of the medieval household, typically took charge of the brewing. They'd mix malted barley or oats with water, boil the concoction to kill off nastier microbes, then ferment it to create what we now call small beer, a low-alcohol beverage that was safe and nourishing. Now here's where it gets fascinating. This home-brewed beer wasn't just consumed within the family. It often became a form of currency. That's right. Beer was sometimes used as payment or barter. In a world where coins were scarce and barter was the lifeblood of trade, offering a jug of freshly brewed beer could settle a debt, secure a favor, or grease the wheels of local commerce. Imagine swapping a basket of eggs for a pitcher of beer, or paying your miller with a few liters of your finest batch. It was a practical, tangible way to keep the economy ticking. This brewing tradition also contributed directly to the household economy in a way that might surprise us. By brewing their own beer, peasants reduced their reliance on sometimes unreliable or expensive external supply chains. It was an act of self-sufficiency and resilience. When crops failed or harsh winters arrived, those jugs of small beer could provide essential calories and hydration, keeping families going when food was scarce. And let's not forget the role of beer in maintaining the health of the workforce, those hardy souls who toiled from dawn until dusk in fields, forests, and workshops. The physical labor demanded by medieval life was nothing short of grueling. Without modern nutrition or energy supplements, peasants needed a steady source of calories and hydration. Beer delivered just that. It was packed with carbohydrates, a little protein, and some B vitamins produced during fermentation, all essential for stamina and recovery. In many ways, beer was the medieval equivalent of today's sports drink, nourishing bodies and minds alike. Now, here's a lovely little detail that brings it all to life. Historical records, including household accounts and local manorial rolls, often list quantities of beer allocated to workers. These entries weren't just about indulgence. They were official, recorded rations. The very fact that beer was documented as part of the daily provisions speaks volumes about its importance. It wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity. But beer's significance stretched beyond individual households. Brewing and consuming beer was a social glue, binding communities together. Taverns, inns, and alehouses became vital centers for interaction, news sharing, and even local governance. In those lively hubs, peasants, craftsmen, and travelers mingled, exchanged stories, and strengthened social bonds. It's quite the image. Imagine the warm glow of a fire, the murmur of voices, the clinking of wooden mugs filled with frothy small beer. These moments of shared refreshment help sustain not only bodies but spirits. There's an economic ripple effect in the broader picture. Brewing required raw materials, barley, oats, hops, and clean water that supported local agriculture and trade. Farmers grew and sold grain specifically for brewing purposes, while coopers crafted barrels to store and transport the precious liquid. Brewers, maltsters, and coopers were skilled tradespeople who formed an essential part of the medieval economy. Even in small villages, the network supporting beer production was complex and interconnected. And here's a thought that might make you smile. Some historians argue that beer brewing contributed to the rise of early market towns. As demand for beer grew, so did opportunities for trade and commerce. Markets sprang up where peasants could sell surplus beer or exchange it for other goods. This helped shape the economic landscape of medieval Europe, nudging it towards more organized commercial systems. Now, I want to pause here and invite you to ponder something. We tend to think of medieval peasants as poor, struggling folk with little to their name. Yet beer, a simple, humble drink, was a treasure that supported their survival, economy, and community life. It's a wonderful reminder that sometimes the smallest things hold the greatest power. Oh, and before I forget, let's talk briefly about the social and economic realities that made beer so indispensable. Water sources back then were often contaminated with all manner of pathogens. Drinking untreated water risked deadly diseases like dysentery and cholera. Brewing meant boiling the water, which killed off many harmful germs, making beer a far safer alternative. So in a very real sense, beer wasn't just a comfort. It was life-saving medicine disguised as a daily drink. This necessity shaped social habits and economic structures. Brewing knowledge was passed down through families, becoming a vital skill. The ability to produce good, safe beer could elevate a household's status and security. It was a source of pride as well as sustenance. And in times of hardship, Be it famine, war, or plague, beer was often all that stood between survival and despair. Now, here comes a little secret that often slips through the cracks in history books. Despite its crucial role, beer brewing wasn't a purely male domain. Women were the chief
Brewers in many households, managing this essential task alongside childcare, cooking, and farming. Their expertise ensured the quality and safety of the beer, making them guardians of their family's health and livelihood. It's a fascinating glimpse into the invisible labor that kept medieval society going. So, to sum up this part of our journey, beer was far more than a morning pick-me-up for medieval peasants. It was a cornerstone of their economy, a vital part of household survival, and a social lifeline. Brewing was an economic activity woven deeply into daily life,
supporting trade, employment, and community cohesion. The humble pint of small beer carried with it calories, nutrition, safety, and even social status. Now, as we sit here reflecting on all this, maybe it's time to raise an imaginary glass, not just to the beer itself, but to the remarkable resilience and ingenuity of those medieval peasants. Their morning beer habit wasn't just a quaint custom. It was a lifeline that saved lives, shaped economies, and bound communities together. And just when you think you've grasped the full picture, there's even more to uncover about how this liquid gold influenced health and society in ways we're only beginning to appreciate. But we'll save that for the next chapter. For now, let's carry with us the thought that sometimes history's greatest stories come not from grand castles or kings, but from the everyday lives and simple choices of ordinary people and their mugs of beer. So, here we are, looking back across the centuries at a habit that might seem downright odd to us now. Medieval peasants kicking off their day not with a cup of tea or coffee, but with a mug of beer. At first glance, it might sound a bit mad. Beer for breakfast? But as we've journeyed through this story, it's clear this wasn't just a quirky tradition. It was a clever, life-saving practice born out of necessity, practicality, and a surprising grasp of health, even if they didn't call it that themselves. Now, I want you to imagine something for a moment. Picture the muddy village lanes of medieval Europe, the early morning chill biting at your skin. You're a peasant, perhaps preparing for a long day's labor in the fields or the workshop. Clean water? A rare luxury. Wells and streams often brimming with unseen dangers, bacteria and parasites lurking invisibly, ready to strike down the unsuspecting. So what do you reach for? A mug of small beer, a lightly fermented brew with just a whisper of alcohol, enough to kill off those nasty bugs, but gentle enough to drink throughout the day. This simple daily ritual tells us a great deal about medieval life, far beyond just the curious habit itself. It reveals a remarkable early awareness of hygiene and health, even if it wasn't framed in the scientific terms we would use today. You see, boiling water during the brewing process killed harmful microorganisms that plagued their water supplies. That alone must have saved countless lives. Beer wasn't just a treat or a social lubricant, it was a vital health safeguard. What's truly fascinating and perhaps quite humbling is how natural fermentation brought unexpected nutritional benefits too. Those humble peasants, with their coarse bread and simple fare, found in beer a source of carbohydrates to fuel their back-breaking work, a little protein, and even B vitamins produced by the yeasts at work in the brew. It's like nature's own multivitamin, brewed in a humble wooden barrel. The beer was more than just liquid energy. It was a nourishing companion through the toil of the day. But there's more to it than just health and nutrition. The social aspect of beer drinking was woven deep into the fabric of medieval society. Sharing a mug at dawn or dusk was a communal act, a quiet moment of camaraderie and stability in a world often precarious and harsh. You might say beer was their silent partner, a daily ritual that anchored their days and connected their lives. Now, here's where it gets really fascinating. If we think about our own lives today, what can this tell us? For starters, it reminds us that even in the darkest corners of history, people found practical, thoughtful ways to look after themselves and their communities. They didn't have doctors on every corner, modern science, or bottled water, but they understood the importance of clean, safe hydration. They knew instinctively that what they drink could save or cost lives. And isn't that something to marvel at? In some ways, the medieval peasants were pioneers of public health. Their small beer was an early form of prevention, a natural barrier against disease before the germ theory was even dreamed of. It's a testament to human ingenuity, how necessity drives invention, and how traditions, born out of survival, can echo down the ages with lessons for us still. Now, of course, we don't need to turn to beer to stay healthy or safe from waterborne illness today, thank goodness. But what might we take from their example? Well, for one thing, it's a reminder not to overlook the value of the natural processes behind what we consume. Fermentation, for instance, is making a comeback in the modern world, with probiotics and gut health becoming hot topics, and artisanal brewers celebrating time-honored techniques. Those ancient brewers knew something about the power of tiny microbes, even if they didn't call them that. And here's a thought. In a world rushing towards ever more processed and packaged foods and drinks, reflecting on the simplicity and wholesomeness of medieval beer drinking invites us to appreciate the roots of our daily comforts. Our modern ales, lagers, and stouts carry within them centuries of tradition, science, and culture, even if we usually just enjoy them for their taste and company. But beyond the science and the nutrition, there's a cultural richness in this story that's easy to miss if we only look through the lens of fact and figure. Beer was, and still is, a social glue, a way people bond, celebrate, and mark their place in the world. Those morning mugs of small beer weren't just about survival. They were about belonging, routine, and a shared human experience. We could say that by understanding the role of beer in medieval life, we also gain insight into how people made sense of their world and cared for one another. It's a bridge across time, connecting us to lives lived simply but with resilience and community spirit. Now, I wonder, have you ever thought about what your morning drink says about your day or your culture? Perhaps your cup of tea or coffee carries stories of tradition, comfort, or energy, just as the peasants' beer did. There's something deeply human in these rituals, isn't there? They ground us, offer reassurance, and prepare us to face whatever the day holds. And on that note, it's worth pausing to think about how many habits we take for granted today might have similar hidden depths. What lessons might be tucked away in the daily things we do without a second thought? Could there be wisdom in old customs we've forgotten or dismissed? So, as we reflect on the morning beer habit of medieval peasants, it feels like we're touching something timeless. It's a story of survival, yes, but also of adaptation, community, and the human capacity to find solutions even in the most challenging circumstances. It's a reminder that health and happiness often come from a mix of science, tradition, and a little bit of common sense. And finally, there's a quiet beauty in recognizing that what might seem strange at first glance, beer for breakfast, was actually a life-saving, nourishing, and culturally rich practice. It challenges us to look beyond our own assumptions and appreciate the ingenuity of those who came before us. So, next time you raise a glass, whatever it might be, perhaps there's room to think about the layers of meaning and history behind it. a nod to the peasants who started their days with a humble beer, keeping sickness at bay and spirits high. And who knows, maybe that bit of perspective will make your own morning ritual feel a little more connected to the past and to each other. And up next, we'll explore how these medieval habits echo in modern brewing and what they tell us about the enduring relationship between people, culture, and the drinks we share. It's a story that continues to unfold, full of surprises and connections waiting to be discovered. So stick around. We've only just begun to scratch the surface. Cheers to history and to the small things that make all the difference. Imagine waking up on a chilly morning in medieval England. You're a peasant, ready to face a day of hard graft in the fields, hours of back-breaking labor ahead. Now, picture reaching not for a cup of tea or a glass of water, but a mug of beer. Seems odd to us, doesn't it? Beer for breakfast? But yet for those early workers, this was not only normal, it was essential for survival. So, how exactly did this humble drink save medieval lives? Let's take a moment to sum up the remarkable story behind that morning pint of small beer and why it mattered more than you might imagine. First off, the simple fact is this: water was a bit of a gamble back then. Rivers, wells, and streams, these were often contaminated with all sorts of nasties. Bacteria, parasites, and other invisible dangers lurked in every drop. Drinking untreated water was like rolling dice with your health. Illnesses like dysentery and cholera were common, and many didn't survive the effects. Now, here's where beer entered the picture as a lifesaver. Brewing involves boiling the water,
which kills a good deal of those harmful microorganisms. Then, fermentation adds its own magic, creating an environment hostile to pathogens. The result? A drink much safer than the murky water peasants might otherwise have swallowed without a second thought. But it wasn't just about safety. Beer, especially small beer, with its low alcohol content, somewhere between 0.5% to 2.5%, played a vital nutritional role. It wasn't the kind of strong ale you might picture. Rather, it was a daily staple, consumed in generous quantities throughout the day. This small beer was a source of carbohydrates, a bit of protein, and some B vitamins, all products of the fermentation process, which helped fuel the intense physical labor peasants endured. Think about that for a moment. Working long hours in the fields, pulling crops, tilling soil, or chopping wood, such work demands steady energy and hydration. Drinking plain water might have been risky, and food supplies weren't always reliable enough to keep up. Small beer filled the gap perfectly. It was a liquid energy bar of its day, hydrating and nourishing the body in one go. Now, let me share a little detail that might surprise you. Archaeological digs and historical records have uncovered evidence that peasants consumed beer not just occasionally, but daily, sometimes multiple times a day. It was woven into the very fabric of their lives. This wasn't a luxury or a treat. It was an everyday necessity. Without it, survival would have been far tougher. What's truly fascinating is how this tradition reflects the social and economic realities of the time. Brewing was often a domestic affair, carried out in homes or small village breweries. It fostered a sense of community and provided a stable food source in a world where both were scarce. The peasants' morning beer wasn't simply about pleasure or habit. It was about resilience, the ability to fend off disease and maintain strength. Picture the scene. A family gathered around their hearth, sharing a simple breakfast that included small beer. The smell of malt and yeast fills the air, a comforting, familiar scent. It's a moment of warmth and safety in an otherwise harsh world. That morning drink was more than liquid. It was a shield against the invisible threats lurking just beyond the doorstep. And here's where the story deepens. The brewing process itself was a form of early science, an unintentional yet effective method of public health. By boiling the water and fermenting the grains, peasants inadvertently reduced the spread of waterborne diseases. In a time before germ theory or vaccines, beer was quite literally life-saving medicine. It's no exaggeration to say that this small beer helped reduce illness and death rates in medieval communities. Now, you might wonder about the alcohol content. Surely drinking alcohol first thing in the morning isn't all that healthy. Well, here's the clever bit. Small beer was very mild, often containing less alcohol than some modern soft drinks contain caffeine. It was safe enough to drink throughout the day without impairing workers' abilities. This meant peasants could stay hydrated and nourished without the risks associated with stronger ales or spirits. So what can we take away from all this? Beer was far more than a recreational drink for medieval peasants. It was a vital, nutritious, and life-preserving part of their daily routine, a liquid lifeline that helped them survive conditions we might find quite shocking. It was safer than water, packed with energy, and a testament to human ingenuity in the face of adversity. It's a beautiful irony, isn't it? A drink we often associate with leisure and celebration was once a critical health measure, underpinning the very survival of everyday people. It reminds us that history is full of surprises, and sometimes the ordinary holds extraordinary secrets. Now, here's a question to ponder. How often do we think about the origins of our daily habits? What if the cups of tea, coffee, or water we reach for each morning have stories just as rich and vital as that medieval mug of small beer? History nudges us to look a little closer, to appreciate the twists and turns that brought us to the present. And as we reflect, it's clear that the story of beer in medieval times isn't just about a drink. It's about how people adapted creatively to their environment, using what was at hand to protect themselves and their communities. It's about resilience, practical wisdom, and the fascinating ways culture and survival intertwine. So next time you see a pint of beer, perhaps you'll think twice. Beyond the bubbles and flavor lies a legacy of protection and survival, a reminder of how something so simple made a world of difference. It's a story worth raising a glass to. And with that, we've wrapped up the tale of why medieval peasants drank beer for breakfast, and how that seemingly odd habit actually saved lives. It's a window into a world where necessity drove innovation, and every sip mattered. In our next chapter, we'll explore how these traditions evolved and shaped the social fabric of medieval communities, revealing even more about the power of this ancient brew. Until then, keep that curiosity bubbling. There's always more to uncover. You know, it's rather extraordinary when you stop to think about it, how a habit as simple as drinking beer for breakfast isn't just a quirky historical footnote, but something that still whispers truths into our modern lives. Picture ourselves, settled comfortably in our chairs, cups of tea or coffee in hand, and yet centuries ago, folks started their mornings with a humble brew of small beer. It's a strange thought, isn't it? But this odd little ritual holds far more significance than just a curious custom from dusty history books. Now, why does this even matter to us today? Well, it's a reminder, an echo really, of how human beings have always found ingenious ways to survive and thrive under tough conditions. Back in medieval times, clean water was a rare luxury, often a dangerous risk. Wells and rivers were frequently contaminated, harboring invisible threats that could bring about devastating illness. So, people turned to beer, not just for the taste, but because the brewing process acted like a primitive form of water purification. Boiling the water, fermenting it, these steps killed off the nasties lurking in the water, making it safer than drinking straight from the stream. Small beer, with its gentle alcohol content, was a daily lifesaver. Imagine for a moment the medieval peasant waking at dawn, the air crisp, the village stirring, and instead of reaching for a cup of water, they'd pour themselves a mug of this weak beer. It was nourishing too, packed with carbohydrates, a touch of protein, some B vitamins, all the fuel needed to keep going through back-breaking work in the fields. Not just a drink, but a form of sustenance. It's a bit like having your breakfast and hydration rolled into one, isn't it? In a way, their morning pint was a shield, a small but mighty protector against the invisible enemies carried in contaminated water. But here's where it gets fascinating. This habit wasn't just about survival. It was woven into the very fabric of their social and economic lives. Beer was affordable, accessible, and deeply tied to community and culture. Brewing wasn't some mysterious art restricted to monks or nobles. It was a household skill, a tradition passed down through generations. And so, while today we might raise an eyebrow at the idea of breakfast beer, back then it was perfectly sensible, even essential. It speaks volumes about how people adapt and innovate using the resources at hand. What truly strikes me is how this ancient practice shines a light on the relationship between science and tradition. Without the scientific tools we possess now, medieval peasants nonetheless stumbled upon a life-saving method simply by brewing beer. They didn't understand germs or bacteria in the way we do now, but their tradition acted as a kind of early practical microbiology. It's a beautiful blend of human intuition and necessity, leading to a solution that saved countless lives. And reflecting on this makes me wonder, how often do we overlook the wisdom embedded in the past? The customs that might seem odd or outdated at first glance often hold deeper truths. By understanding why medieval peasants drank beer for breakfast, we appreciate not just an oddity, but a survival strategy. It invites us to see history not as a dry list of facts, but as a vibrant story of human resilience. Now, I don't want us to romanticize medieval life too much. After all, it was harsh and unforgiving. But recognizing that small beer was more than just a drink helps us connect more deeply with
Those who lived before us. It reminds us that they faced dangers we can barely imagine today, and yet they found ways to protect themselves using clever, if humble, means. It's a lesson in how innovation often arises from necessity, constrained by circumstance, but powered by human spirit. Here's a thought. Next time you lift your morning cup, perhaps you'll feel a quiet kinship with those medieval peasants. Their morning beer was not just about quenching thirst or filling bellies. It was about safeguarding their health, their families, their futures. It was a daily ritual that quietly shaped the course of history. And isn't that something rather wonderful to carry with us? Of course, we now have the luxury of clean water on tap and a myriad of health information at our fingertips. But looking back, we gain perspective. We see how cultural heritage and science entwine in unexpected ways, teaching us to value the knowledge handed down through generations. It's this connection that enriches our understanding of the past and colors how we view present-day health and nutrition. And beyond the historical curiosity, there is an invitation here. What if we took a moment to embrace the lessons history offers, to respect that every tradition, every habit emerged for a reason, often to meet challenges humanity faced together? Sharing these stories, reflecting on their meaning, helps us appreciate the ingenuity and resilience that we all inherit. It makes history alive, relevant, and deeply human. So, what do you make of it? Does it surprise you that a pint of medieval small beer could be a lifesaver? Or perhaps it makes you curious about the other everyday customs that might have hidden depths. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Maybe you know of old traditions in your own family or culture that, like medieval beer, carried more than meets the eye. Sharing these stories connects us all, weaving a rich tapestry of human experience. Before we wrap up, let's take a moment to appreciate the remarkable journey beer has taken from a simple, practical drink to a cultural icon enjoyed worldwide. And yet, for all its modern glitz, its roots lie in something profoundly human: the drive to survive, adapt, and protect one another. That's a powerful legacy to hold on to. If you've enjoyed exploring this fascinating slice of history with me, why not share it with a friend? Maybe they'll be just as intrigued by the idea that a medieval peasant's morning beer was more than a habit, it was a lifeline. And if you fancy going deeper, there are plenty more stories about how our ancestors' everyday choices shaped the world we live in today. In the end, these reflections remind us that history isn't just about what happened long ago, it's about what it means for us now. Every tradition carries a story, every habit a lesson. And sometimes the strangest customs turn out to be the most astonishingly wise. So here's to the medieval peasants and their breakfast beer, a simple, humble drink that saved lives and still, in its way, matters today. Thanks so much for joining me on this journey. I hope it sparked a bit of wonder and maybe even a new appreciation for the curious, clever ways our ancestors looked after themselves. Until next time, take care. And remember, sometimes the past has the best stories to tell. Cheers. Let me know what you think in the comments below.